Imagine my children sitting around the fireplace in a remote village deep in the mountains, surrounded by dense fog creeping into every corner as if trying to hide something dreadful. That was my village, and that was the night I'll never forget. It was the winter of 1942, and I was just 14 years old. I remember the wind howling through the trees as we, the boys from the village, gathered around the fireplace to tell stories. But what happened that night was no ordinary tale. Through the thick fog enveloping the village, we heard ominous whispers. My heart pounded as we all gazed into the darkness of the forest, expecting something dreadful to emerge. That's when old Jovan stood up and said he had to go to the church to pray for protection. His voice was serious, filled with fear, and we all felt the chill creeping into our bones. We decided to follow him to the church. We walked through the thickening fog as we approached the old building. When we arrived, Jovan knelt before the altar and began to pray, while we stood around him, trembling with fear. Then we heard footsteps behind us. We turned and saw a shadow emerging from the darkness. My heart almost stopped. I realized it was the priest from the neighboring village, Priest Marko. He told us he had come to investigate the voices from the forest, and together we headed towards the cemetery, which was just on the edge of the woods where the sounds grew louder. We arrived at the cemetery and found a sight that chilled us to the bone. The graves were open and bodies were removed and scattered on the ground. Then we heard eerie voices coming from the depths of the cemetery, a sound like sinister laughter echoing through the night. But the worst was yet to come. One of my friends, Luca, began to behave strangely. His eyes filled with redness, and his body started to convulse as if he were being tormented by some invisible force. We realized he was possessed by a demon. Priest Marko immediately sprang into action. He raised the cross and began to recite prayers while we stood around Luca, holding hands, praying for his liberation. The battle was tough and long, but in the end, Priest Marko managed to defeat the demon and send it back to hell, saving poor Luca. The next day, after the unsettling night, we all gathered at the cemetery. We returned all the bodies to their graves, buried them, and held a funeral service. We did this every day, praying to God to survive the night and avoiding the forest and cemetery. But the paranormal activities persisted, and each evening brought a new wave of fear and unease. But even after the exorcism, the strange paranormal activities didn't cease. The forest still echoed with ominous sounds, and the cemetery remained a place of dread and fear. We realized our fight had only just begun, and we would have to face even greater evil before we could all sleep peacefully that night. 52 days passed, and the dark forces still loomed over our village. But then we heard the news that changed everything. Old Milodin from the village was suddenly found hanged in his barn. He was 78 years old. We were all shocked, but Priest Marko realized why this was happening. When someone commits suicide, the priest doesn't hold a funeral service for the soul, and the wandering soul remains in our world, tormenting the living. Priest Marko immediately went to the cemetery and held a funeral service for Milodin at his grave. From that moment on, peace returned to our village. Milodin's soul finally found rest, and with it, all the paranormal activities that plagued us disappeared. From that day on, we no longer had to fear the dark forces that haunted us, but a sense of dread still lingered when we passed by the cemetery. And that night, what possessed my friend Luca, what dark force it was, who can know? All I know is that Luca wasn't himself, and from that night until his death, he wasn't in a good mental state. He went insane shortly after the exorcism. His family took him to neighboring villages to see some old grandma witchcraft doctors, as they couldn't afford medical doctors, being poor. He lived like that for about 10 years and unfortunately died. And so, my children, that's the story that I experienced. And you like, share, and subscribe for more such terrifying tales from my life experience. Go with God, my children, until the next story. Goodbye.